Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. Big proponent of capitalism. That's what I am. And a fundamental aspect of capitalism is the right to trade with whomever we would like to. Today, to help us dig into that a little bit, is Dr. Karras Lambert, who recently graduated from the George Mason School of Economics, or actually graduated with a Ph.D. in economics from George Mason University, would be a better way to say it. Karras Lambert, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here. Thanks for your interest in the article that I published recently with my friend Tate Fegley.
Yeah. So what is free trade? We hear a lot about trade, fair trade, free trade. What is free trade?
Free trade is the same principle applied locally and internationally and anywhere. It's just the people make their own choices who to buy and sell with, what to buy and sell, in what quantities and qualities. And insofar as those choices of individuals aren't interfered with or somehow stifled, then it's free trade. So you don't need any kind of agreements to allow free trade. You don't need, all you need to do is not interfere with the private choices of people in their roles as consumers or producers or anything. Yeah.
So as a proponent of free trade, would you be opposed to NAFTA, or what is it now, the USMCA?
Yeah, I deal a lot more in theory, so I'm not so equipped to talk in detail about these kind of trade deals. But in a general level, yeah, like the so-called free trade deals are actually just carve-outs for a lot of special interests.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, given the existence of governments that heavily interfere in the economy, it's hard for me to say for sure what would happen absent these free trade deals. I don't, what would they decide to do if they didn't hack out these crony deals? I'm not sure. So it's hard for me to counterfactually compare what would happen without them. But for sure, this isn't free trade. And actually, a lot of the protectionists, like one of the guys whose book I kind of address in the article that you were interested in talking about, he kind of acknowledges in the book that we don't really have free trade, and then goes on to say free trade is the cause of all of our problems. So it's kind of this funny view that protectionists tend to have. They blame everything they don't like on free trade, but then they admit on the other hand that what's called free trade in the popular press is not free trade at all.
What are some of the arguments against free trade? Because it seems so obvious to me that people should just be allowed to trade with whomever they please, as long as these trades are voluntary. But there's a lot of opponents to it. So what are their arguments?
Yeah, they kind of, it's one of these cases where they like throw everything at the wall and they see what sticks. So if we want to psychologize and be ungenerous, as Mises did occasionally, so I feel like I can do it. They want to have this policy conclusion for whatever reason, which we can speculate about, and then they try to create justifications for it later. And it's better to create intellectual looking justifications rather than just saying, I just prefer it this way. I want this, and I don't care about your freedom. So that was what I tried to focus on in my article, was just saying, don't pretend that there's this really strong intellectual foundation for the protectionist argument. You can make the argument for some specific protectionism, but at least be honest with what your goals are and what you're willing to advocate to accomplish what you think the means are necessary to accomplish the goals, right? So, for example, one of the common arguments is the infant industries argument. You've probably heard about it, where the protectionists will say, oh, well, if the government doesn't somehow raise the price of foreign goods or ban them entirely or something, we won't ever be able to develop competitive industries because there's some first mover advantage, some economies of scale going on with the companies that already exist in other regions. Whatever region you prefer that industry being in your economy rather than some other place for some reason. It's their like value judgment. So they say, well, given that it's harder to start up an industry and enter an industry, therefore we need protection to let it get started. And then once the industry gets started, then we can relax the protections and then they can compete on the free market. And there are several rebuttals to this that Austrian economists have raised over the years. One is that basically there's no when you create this kind of environment where the infant industry is protected by all these various protections from foreign competition, why would you assume that there's ever a point at which you can remove the protections and it'll suddenly be competitive? Because it only exists in an anti-competitive environment, or in an environment of limited competition, right? So actually its business model as such, given its evolution from the genesis to how it exists, it is operating outside of the competitive market. So there's no reason ex ante, before you make the choice to invest in any given industry, to actually be able to think you're correct in identifying the proper industry that will actually be an efficient producer in a comparative advantage sense in the world, right? So that's one way to tackle that kind of argument. Other things what I was addressing in this article that you read and you asked to talk about is they look at Ricardo's exposition of comparative advantage, which you probably understand well, right? And they say, oh well, there's all these assumptions there, and then they look at the assumptions there, and then they look at our world and they say, well, the assumptions don't hold, so therefore, and then they just say all these horrible things in the world that they think are the cause of free trade. So what you have to do is you basically have to unpack each claim and show that like actually what you're identifying is not the important aspect of the case for trade, which is just the case for voluntary exchange in general, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to go from there. Like so it's kind of it puts the defenders of free trade in a tough position, because they just throw nonstop arguments. No, like they could just point to anything in the world they don't like and say this is from free trade, and then you say no, it has nothing to do with free trade, or it has very little to do, or like we can't even know for sure if it has anything to do with it, because we live in such an interventionist age that there's so many different factors going on in the, what's causing certain dislocations in the American economy, we can say, or with like the the South or the Midwest, like not doing as well. Why is that? It's not necessarily because of lower tariffs in the 20th century. We have to talk reasonably about different theoretical ideas.
You mentioned David Ricardo. I believe Ricardo developed his theory of comparative cost in 1819. Ludwig von Mises elaborated on it, clarified some things, and I believe made it stronger. So what was Mises's interpretation or presentation of the Mises, I believe, called it, as you said, the law of association. So what is that?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think Mises definitely improved upon the formulation. That doesn't mean what Ricardo said was wrong at all. It's just it was very limited. It was profound, but also as written in Principles of Political Economy by Ricardo, it's limited and led to these kind of criticisms that you see now. So what Ricardo did was he drew this kind of hypothetical situation where there's two countries, and then they each, there's like two goods that are produced, and then they use the same factors of production to produce these goods, and then they're non-specific, so you can shift the factors of production into the production of either one of these goods, right? And he's saying if the goods themselves are mobile, but the labor and capital isn't, then certain results follow. That it's beneficial to trade according to your relative efficiency, or your so-called comparative advantage. Or even if you're absolutely poor at producing both goods in this example, if you're relatively better at producing one of them, if the cost is relatively less for your production of one line instead of the other, then a country specializing in that thing in which they're relatively better at, even if they're absolutely worse in both production processes, then you'll still be wealthier overall by specializing and exchanging, right? However, Ricardo's exposition used countries. He used countries as a unit of analysis, right? And also he had these assumptions, as I mentioned, about labor not being able to move and capital not being able to move, right? So that opens the door for these kind of rebuttals that, oh, well, you free market fundamentalists, you keep hearkening back to Ricardo, but even Ricardo acknowledged that it's only under these very restrictive circumstances that we can say this and that, right? Mises comes along, and Mises says, yeah, like what Ricardo said is true, but it's actually more general than what Ricardo said. You don't need to draw all these restrictions, right? What Ricardo identified, what he like analytically identified about how the numbers work, how the relative efficiency works, is that for all of human society is the result of this fact, what he called the law of association, that by engaging in cooperation, by specializing and trading with other people, we are better off than if we just went into the woods and lived a solitary life. If what you value is material abundance, right? If you value the hermit life, then you can do that, but then you're giving up all of the benefits of civilization, essentially, right? So Mises makes this point. So he integrates it his general framework of economic theory much more clearly than just simply a kind of a one-shot theoretical model. He's saying no, like society itself is a product of the fact that the division of labor is more productive than isolated action. And if that wasn't true, then if it wasn't true that you benefit by peacefully specializing and exchanging, then there would be a selective advantage to not being peaceful. There would be a selective advantage to being violent, right? Like people who are violent would be better off than people who are peaceful, which is actually not the case, except for in some very limited time span, right? You can beat someone and take their stuff, but then you're forsaking all of the future exchange opportunities you would have. So Mises realized that the implications of Ricardo's discovery are much further ranging and much more general than Ricardo himself exposited. And when you think of it in the terms that Mises laid down, this law of association being more general, it's more about individuals, because countries don't trade, individuals trade.
Yeah.
So when you realize this, you realize a lot of these criticisms of Ricardo in particular, while understandable to an extent, because Ricardo did use countries as a unit of analysis, it doesn't really have to do with countries per se. It has to do with the benefits of trade at all. So that's why I think it's important to understand what Mises said about it, and not just like stick with Ricardo, which is what a lot of these critics and proponents of free trade tend to do.
So we go back in pre-Adam Smith that we had mercantilism, and the mercantilists believe that a country was rich or poor based on the amount of gold that it had in the country. So if you're buying products from another country, you have an outflow of gold, and they believe that made them poorer. But Adam Smith came along in 1776 and explains, no, you just have, like you said, people are trading because they prefer the item they're getting over the gold they have. And ultimately, the reason that people are engaging in these trades is because they believe they'll be better off afterwards. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it, right? And a simple way, tell me if I'm off base, because I'm not the PhD, but the law of comparative advantage or comparative cost association, by many names, is basically this: if you and I are in an economic unit or an economic system, and I make both microphones better than you do, and I can make computers better than you do, but ultimately my time and resources are limited. So it's better for me to say, you know what, Dr. Lambert makes microphones better than he makes computers, and they're satisfactory enough for me to use. So why don't I focus on computers, let him focus on microphones? We could have a trade, and we'll both be better off than if I try to do everything. That's that's a simplified, but that's basically
that's basically right. About. Yeah, that's basically how to think about it. Yeah. And a lot of these critics of these critics of free trade, they recognize that trade's important. So it's not like they say like, oh, we should all go live alone, but the logic of their arguments inevitably leads to that implication that, oh, we should all, like, if what they're saying is true in a limited sense for some specific thing, then why isn't it true all the way down to an individual person living? Because so the logic of their argument kind of falls apart when you think in these kind of general terms. And you brought up the point about economic history with mercantilists and Adam Smith, and what you said is the conventional way of understanding it. And as far as I know, it's true. I have read people saying that the mercantilists are like kind of unfairly caricatured. I don't know enough to get into that. I'm just but what you said is completely true. If that's what they were specifically arguing, that was definitely true. And that's something that the current protectionists who we're kind of discussing fall prey to, in a sense, these kind of fallacies, because they don't grasp, or they don't like clearly grasp, and they don't keep it in the front of their minds that money itself is a good. So when you as you said, when you trade money for something, or when you receive money for something, as you said, you're just preferring the money or not preferring, or you're preferring the good, the non-money good to the money. So either way, we can't say you're worse off or better off when you buy a sandwich or something. It's like, what do you mean? Like, I paid the money because I wanted the sandwich, and then later I work for some employer, or I work up, for my own entrepreneurial activity to earn money. And then that's the way, everyone has their own balance of payments with everyone else. And we don't say it's a big problem when you have a current account deficit with the supermarket. because we understand, yeah, of course you have a current account deficit with the supermarket because they're not paying you in money. You're paying them money for, yeah. So when you think in these very general terms, it's easier to keep your mind straight about what we're talking about. And the kind of protectionist arguments tend to they like to get bogged down in like technicalities, much lower stages of argumentation, and they don't consider these very fundamental considerations, because it's easier to like do kind of verbal voodoo once you're doing technicalities than when you're just asking in plain English, like, so how can people be better off if you take away their best option? Like, how does that make anyone right? And then when you ask that kind of simple question, I think it's more productive to like at least figure out that you're not going to convince anyone at minimum, and at best you can convince them that, oh yeah, actually the logic of it is sound. Like, you can't really argue against that.
What you said a few minutes ago about if it's good for a small system, why wouldn't it just be good for everybody? It reminds me of, I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, I don't know, probably 25, maybe 27 years ago, and he had Pat Buchanan on. And Pat Buchanan was arguing for tariffs to protect the industries here. And I remember thinking, if capitalism is good within America, why isn't capitalism just good? How does it go bad just because you've introduced trade with another arbitrarily defined unit that somebody's drawn a border around? It just didn't make sense to me. And you're also right that they don't try to stop trade altogether. They try to like rig it, I guess is the only word I can think of. And they do it by means of tariffs. But what exactly are tariffs and who pays them? Like when Trump was running for office, he would say, we're going to put tariffs on Chinese goods and make them pay.
Right.
But so what are tariffs and who actually pays them?
Yeah, well, in an ultimate sense, everyone pays because everyone's poor. So that's the sad truth, right? Because you're just restricting the voluntary decisions of people, and you're raising costs, right? But in terms of basically the domestic consumers, if your country imposes tariffs on, let's say, steel, the domestic producers of steel, there's a chance that they might, in monetary terms, benefit more than they are hurt. Because again, steel is an input into many production processes. Okay, so anyone who uses steel, it's now more expensive. So if you're selling steel and you're U.S. producer, you might benefit to some extent, but then you're also being hurt as a consumer. Everyone's a consumer and a producer, or most people are. A lot are, right? So everyone in their roles as consumers, every single person is hurt, and then some people in their roles as producers may get some temporary benefit. But even then, what Rothbard points us out in Man, Economy, and State. This argument kind of fails because what it will end up doing is it distorts the market such that there's now some profit opportunity that would not have existed in steel manufacturing, but then it's just going to expand the domestic steel industry to the point where the profits drop. So it's some time frame, which is not that far off. We don't have to say the long run, just it's some amount of years. It'll no longer even be that beneficial to have this, even for those producers, because then suddenly new entrants came in to suck up the profit opportunity. And then we're just in what Tulloch called a transitional gains trap, where removing the tariff will negatively impact the bottom line of these industries that were protected, and the benefits will be so dispersed that there's not really a political interest group in advocating for the repeal of the tariff at that point, right? So these are the kind of dynamics that end up happening with tariffs when you're just basically raising the price of foreign goods in order for your domestic industry to be able to compete and grow, to be able to produce without a disadvantage, insofar as they might have it without the tariff. So that's kind of an issue with tariff that I think gets to your question. And another point that might be interesting to you and your audience is that there's literally no way for a government to know what they should protect, right? Like you can work out problems on a blackboard, you can draw up equations, and you can construct hypothetical counterfactual examples that if we don't do the tariff, then this will happen, and if we do it, then this will happen. But there's actually no way to ever empirically verify any of this stuff, right? So all of these arguments saying if we don't give a tariff, then this will result, or if we had a tariff, then we would have kept our this industry or whatever. They're all just arbitrary. Like we can all just say whatever we think might have happened, and there's no scientific way to mediate to resolve our disputes, right? So it's not really an economic topic. It's economics in the sense that you're talking about prices, but the policy aspect of it is completely arbitrary and an artifact of politics. So what I'm hoping to do with this kind of article that we're talking about is just point out that what they're doing is not scientifically grounded. Like don't construct this barrier between your preferences for some arbitrary domestic industry that you want for whatever reason. You know, it could be any reason at all. And maybe some people will agree, and maybe it's not that unreasonable, but at least be honest with what your goals are, and don't dress it up with this veneer of scientific respectability, which actually doesn't exist if you understand properly in like the Misesian, Austrian sense, the benefits of trade, right?
Now, tariffs, I understand they raise prices. But the actual tax, because that's what tariffs are, right? They're just a tax on imports.
Right.
The people that pay the tax are actually the individuals in the importing country, right? Am I mistaken about that? Like if I'm in China and I sell a good to an American company, the American company is the one that pays that tax.
So I don't know so much about the exact mechanics of it.
Okay.
I'm more into like general economic theory. So
Okay.
regardless of who literally pays upfront, what I was saying before is true. Where like everyone pays eventually, right? So I'm sorry, I'm not the best person to talk to about like the specific mechanisms of like government accounting and stuff, and like but
you're probably better off.
the domestic, because I tend, my personal interests are more in like epistemology and philosophy of economics and history of thought. So when you get bogged down in these kind of issues, this is something I probably should know, to be honest, but I just never, it's hard for me to care because these kind of things change. And then like what you think you learn one year is like irrelevant the next year when you're worried about like government stuff, like the specific mechanics of it rather than like general principles of it. So my personal interests lead me more towards like what I've been describing with like association, less so with like the actual mechanics. But regardless of who literally pays at the moment, it's just it's paid by everyone in lower standards of living, over time.
Fair enough. Now you mentioned a couple times the Austrian school, and I know you mentioned Mises, and I read your article in the Mises Wire, I think it was. So I'm assuming you are from the Austrian school, or to some extent adhere to the Austrian school. But when it comes to trade and tariffs, economists of virtually every school agree that tariffs are counterproductive. They don't achieve the goals. That's correct, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Because as I mentioned before, the Ricardian analysis is fundamentally correct. Like what Mises said was what Ricardo said, just dropping all those restrictive assumptions and properly locating the unit of analysis at the individual and not the country. So that's all. So the logic, the analytical logic of comparative advantage is like unassailable. So anyone following that tradition, which is basically all economists, that's like the one thing that they all agreed on for like a long time. And it might be falling away now compared to how it was, 20 years ago or so. But they disagree on most other things. But yeah, almost everyone agrees, even if for different reasons. And as I said, the Ricardian justification, while not wrong at all, lends itself to the kind of criticisms that I was addressing that people can criticize because they don't take it to the logical conclusion of the pro-trade argument. They don't take the logical conclusion of individuals freely transacting. They stick to this blackboard exercise, and it makes people think that there's some holes in the reasoning if you drop certain assumptions or something. So that's why I think it's important to take it to the Misesian way, even though they're fundamentally compatible and very similar. There's nothing incompatible with what Mises said than with what Ricardo said. Just Mises generalized it, and I think it's more important to generalize than to stay specific and contingent the way Ricardo did.
Sure. Another area where I believe most economists agree, and to me, it's the same dynamic. It's a matter of who people choose to associate with, and that's immigration. So what are your thoughts generally on immigration? I'm not looking for specifics, if X amount of immigrants come in, right. What's the effect on unemployment? Just generally, what are your thoughts on immigration and their effect on the overall well-being of human beings?
Yeah. So the thing with immigration, I mean, the analysis is fundamentally similar to trade, first of all. So insofar as the choices are voluntary, then the question is who's going to stop them, right? and why? But that's not really an economic argument per se. People make economic arguments, or like some kind of tangentially related economic arguments, saying, well, when immigrants from some cultures will come, they'll vote a certain way, and then therefore they'll erode the political institutions of the country, which will result in lower standards of living and so on and so forth. And again, it's similar to the trade example where we can construct these hypotheticals in our brain, or we can do it on the board, and we can say, oh, if this person comes, they're going to commit a crime, and therefore we should keep them out, or something. Like, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but ex ante, it's hard to say that, right? If someone's willing to hire someone, and someone's willing to contract with them to sell them a home, then who's going to stop them, right? So right now, of course, the U.S. government stops people, or don't, selectively, depending on their preferences for where they're coming from and who they are. But one complication of immigration that doesn't really exist for trade is a matter of property rights. So what I said before is the economic case, where it's saying, like, look, if you own a house and you're inviting someone to your house, then who's to stop this person from another country coming to your house, or to work at your company if you're an employer, right? And then if we have that logic throughout everything that person is going to use on their way to your house, then there's no problem. There's no problem economically speaking. Like everyone freely participated in these series of actions, and there's no issue. But what people object to in the modern situation is that, well, the government is so heavily involved with what's going on in the economy. Famously, Milton Friedman says you can have a welfare state, or you can have open immigration, but you can't have both. I think it was Friedman. I apologize for misattributing, but something like this. So this kind of reasoning isn't like totally off, but it's also, what are you going to do about it at this point, right? So further stifling. So you at that point, you can either advocate repealing the welfare state, or you can advocate adding all these new restrictions. And it's not, from an economic point of view, all we say is that, these restrictions always result in less mutually beneficial exchanges. So people are poorer otherwise, right? That's all we can say economically speaking. So it's limited, but profound, right? Then when you get into these debates about immigration, it just becomes a political matter again, about like, what are your preferences about who you live around, and what is the government doing to make your standards of living lower in other ways and transfer wealth between people. And it makes people very envious and very angry about various other things, where a lot of these issues with immigration would basically go away if the government didn't intervene so much in the economy already, I think. And if property rights were respected universally, or as much closer to universally than they are, because right now there's an issue where migrants are being flown in by governments into public land, and then they disperse, and it's questionable the extent to which it's mutually voluntary on the part of the populace. But insofar as it is voluntary on the part of the populace, then there's no reason to possibly restrict it. So that's why there's a little bit of a complication there. But even then, it's not that you're using economic reasoning against it. You're just saying things are so messed up because of government anyway, that it's hard to untangle exactly what would happen otherwise. So I prefer. So you asked me my opinion. I just prefer to advocate free association, and and repealing government involvement at all. So rather than loudly advocating for various restrictions for anything, that's at best not even a second best solution. It's not even a good solution in my point of view. The good solution is just repeal the bad things that make various distortions occur. And let's do that first at least, and then worry about the other stuff later.
Right.
But that doesn't follow directly from economic theory. It's my understanding of economic theory results in that belief.
Yeah, it absolutely drives me batty when people make arguments like Milton Friedman did there. Not necessarily because I think he's wrong, but because if you say, well, now we have a welfare state, so we can't allow immigrants. So now you put further restrictions on, and restrictions just lead to more restrictions, when we should just be arguing for the repeal of the restrictions. Let's argue, yes, let's reduce immigration, reduce restriction on immigration, and reduce the welfare state. I don't want to pick one or the other. I shouldn't put it that way. I don't want welfare at all. I don't want a welfare state.
Right.
I want freedom, and that applies to immigration as well. So we should have both. And now, while that's not an economic argument, I think that an economic argument can be made in this regard, because people complain, for instance, well, look at the nightmare we have at the border right now. But the nightmare we have at the border right now results from restrictions, because they're blocking people from coming in. You end up with people trying to sneak in, cartels trying to smuggle people in, and you end up with all types of things that would not happen if it was freedom of movement, if it were open immigration. Why is that so hard to grasp? I mean, I know that you probably don't know why it's so hard to grow, but speculate for me.
Well, yeah, there are things you could probably say. So it's very analogous to what we were talking about before with trade, because let's say, like, I'm sure all of us as individuals would prefer we can go anywhere we want, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sure, like, pretty much everyone would hope that they would, like, if they wanted to go to some country, that they wouldn't be stopped. Let's just say that, right? But then once you're there, you might have the same way that a domestic producer who's facing fierce foreign competition might want protection for various reasons. Maybe you have some kind of specialty. So, like, for example, if you teach English and you go to some country where English isn't a language that's commonly spoken and everyone wants to learn English, you could charge a lot for your services, right? But then suddenly, if there's a huge influx of English teachers, you're comparatively less well off than you would have been with more English teachers around you competing with you, right? As a producer of English teaching service, right? So a lot of it is just the same kind of self-interested motivation as saying we should have tariffs. Some people will relatively benefit counterfactually, and some people won't. So I think that's kind of what goes on. In terms of, like, the situation today, like I said, I don't really know the details enough to say, like, to what extent is it like a major crisis or isn't. I don't know. I've seen people saying both sides of it. I stay out of those kind of, like, modern political squabbles, in a sense, because it's hard to know, like, exactly what's going on. But similar to the trade case, where the critics of trade will bemoan all of these features of the modern world or the U.S. and say, oh, look at rising inequality, look at the concentration of wealth in D.C. and New York and California, blah blah blah. But then they don't question, like, central banking policy, or they don't question these various other things that drive these phenomena, right? So it's similar in this case, where let's stipulate that all these people are coming from the South America and Central America to America, which I'm sure is happening. I don't know the extent to which it is, or how people are absorbing them, or whatever. I don't know the empirical details, but let's just say for sure this is happening. The question is, like, hey, why are they leaving their homes like that? And there could be various reasons for that. I don't know exactly what's going on, but a lot of it has to do with U.S. foreign policy driving people, with like the war on drugs, which has created dangerous conditions in those countries, and these kind of things. I can't, off the top of my head, can't think of all the various ways we might be able to argue that it's creating these conditions. But if we had a non-interventionist government that simply respected property rights, let's say at maximum, right, then who knows what the world would look like? Maybe we wouldn't have these crazy movements of masses of people. They would just be individual people moving, maybe, or some families or something. But it might not be hundreds and thousands of people moving as a block. Why is this happening? Asking this question is maybe more productive than other things we might be asking. And then if we know why they're moving, then we could say, okay, well, maybe the government should stop the policies that are producing these horrible effects.
I have one more question for you that's kind of unrelated to why I had you on, but you're recently graduated, Ph.D., Austrian economist. What does the future of Austrian economics look like? Are we going to have a resurgence of Austrian theory in academia?
I hope so. I'm not betting on it, but I hope so, and I'm working towards that, or I will be working towards that for sure. I think the health of the Austrian school as like a school of thought is healthier than almost ever, basically. That doesn't mean we're popular or even that meaningful in a broad sense, but the work of places like the Mises Institute, and there are various universities like George Mason, where I went to, and Texas Tech, which has a program run by a graduate of George Mason, and there's programs popping up here and there that have Austrian influenced, if not Austrian dominant programs, which is not something that really existed much in American history. There was always NYU in the past where Mises was, but it was a kind of limited program. And so I think things are looking as optimistic as they ever might have looked. And plus, things are going so wrong in our world that people are turning to alternative explanations, such as the Austrian explanation. So I think there's no better time than now. With that said, will we have success? It depends on a lot of things that are partly in our control and partly outside of our control. But insofar as it's in our control, I think the people we have working in academia today are doing the best they can and are working hard to affect change and making good arguments. And for my part, I'm hoping to, the same way I was discussing the fundamental considerations of these kind of topics with you, I'm hoping in my small part to bring economists to these more fundamental considerations, especially like epistemology, because this is where I think a lot of these arguments about these various topics follow downstream from disagreements on much more fundamental considerations. So just as a quick example, I've recently published a paper with the same friend, Tate Fegley, who's a professor, published a paper in a journal addressing the socialist calculation debate, which I'm sure you're aware of. So there's still Marxists out there who are saying, well, now with AI and supercomputers, we can do it and no worries, right? But the fact that they're still arguing this just shows how fundamentally dissimilar our views of economics is in general, right? So rather than keep arguing the same thing, I'm trying to get them to like realize like, no, what we mean by like price, value, cost, these kind of terms is just different. Like what we mean by the term economics is different. They have a sense of what they mean by economizing, and what I'm trying to argue, rather than just staying in the same kind of loop argument forever about, no, you can't calculate, yeah, you can, yeah, we can. It's like, what do you even mean by calculation? And then hope like, I don't know if it'll be successful, but my attempt is going to be to try to make it much more fundamental in that way, and hopefully then people will more highly respect the Austrians, because Austrians really need to explain that clearly, because we're so different in epistemology that we have to make it clear why we think, for example, like econometrics isn't economic theory or something, because it currently dominates academia. So my opinion is that that's kind of the battlefield where Austrians need to move to, and just say, look, it's a paradigm difference with what you're doing. Like what we call economics is not the same, and what we're calling economics is integrated with the tradition of economic thought until the early 20th century. So I'm optimistic without being foolishly, expecting it to happen. Hopefully things will look up.
You need to mass distribute the ultimate foundation of economic science.
Yeah, that's my favorite book of Mises's. Yeah, that's my absolute favorite book. Yeah, it's criminally underread. So,
So I said one more question, but now I actually got one more for you. In order of greatness greatness as economists, 1, 2, and 3. Put them in one being the best. Mises, Rothbard, Hayek.
That's yours?
No, I'm asking you. Put them in order.
I see. Okay. So yeah, this is my disclaimer. It's just my personal preference.
Yeah, that's all I want to know.
Because I have a certain style of thinking, as you've been discovering. I kind of just punt on questions of specific things, and I talk more about general theory. Given my interests in general theory, Mises is number 1 for me. Menger is number 2. Because his reason, in my opinion, or in my reading of the Austrian school, Mises basically just came along and like perfected Menger, more or less. There are some things in Mises like monopoly theory where like Rothbard improved and such, but in the essential aspects, Mises basically perfected Menger. And then for a third, I guess I'd say Rothbard. I really love William Henry Hutt, who didn't consider himself an Austrian actually. He considered himself a classical economist, but in his reasoning, he was essentially an Austrian. And he wrote some excellent books against Keynesianism in the 70s.
The Keynesian episode.
Yeah, that, and he wrote The Theory of Idle Resources, which doesn't have Keynesian in the title, but it addresses the concept of involuntary unemployment. And he had a couple other a couple other books too. So Hutt is like a personal favorite of mine, but I don't think he was a better economist than Rothbard. It's just I enjoy reading Hutt in a way that I think he's underrated, and I talk about Hutt a lot in my teaching and in my stuff, because I just think people should know more about what he said. He's very conceptually clear, and that's the kind of thing I favor, is people who really unpack the concepts people are using, and they're trying to get to the bottom of, like, for example, Keynesianism. Like, where did Keynesianism go wrong? And it's like, it's not enough just to look the fifth order arguments of Keynes. You have to really like fundamentally where was he going wrong in his conception of unemployment, for example. And that's the kind of thing I love. And Rothbard does that a lot too in Man, Economy, and State. So I guess I'll say a tie between like Rothbard and Hud. Rothbard a little bit above Hud just because he's a more pure Austrian and improved upon Mises in some ways. But yeah, like that's my personal hierarchy, I guess.
All right. Thanks a lot. So, Dr. Lambert, where can people find you?
Yeah, I don't have a website yet, and I'm still applying for full-time university positions. I'm going through interviews now and stuff, but they can search on Mises.org. If you just search my name, Karras Lambert, Mises, you'll find some articles there. And otherwise, yeah, I have some academic publications that they could find in various sources, and they can always feel free to email me. I'll give my school email here. So if you email me at klamber7@gmail.edu, I can share stuff I've written with you, even if it's otherwise hard to find. So yeah, I'd always be happy to talk with anyone who listens about these kind of topics or about economic theory.
Well,
and yep.
Thanks for a great discussion. I hope you'll come back and talk to me about some of these topics.
Sure. Yeah. If you have anything specific, feel free to shoot me an email.
I certainly will. Thanks a lot. For
Yeah,
now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Remember, let me know what you think. Till next time.